Greetings to everyone and welcome to another University of the Witwatersrand School of Economics and Finance Centenary webinar series. My name is Dr. Cyril and I'll be taking the role of moderator of this webinar. A special welcome to Professor Robert Engle, our esteemed guest. We appreciate you making time in your busy schedule to speak on this crucial climate change related topic. As you're all aware, today's webinar delves into a financial approach to climate risk, a novel approach to analyzing asset price dynamics in an environment of uncertainty and risk in the face of current and expected climate change. Now, before we proceed with this webinar, just a brief overview of the webinar format or agenda. First, Professor Uma Kwalamparambo, the head of the School of Economics and Finance, will present a brief biography of our guest speaker. Then I'll hand over the floor to Professor Engle to present his topic. Professor Engle's presentation will then be followed by a conversation by our three discussants. Our panelists will pose some relevant questions to our guest speaker. And then I'll open the floor to questions from our audience. Kindly add your questions in the Zoom chat window. And given the major time constraint, from the set of questions posted, I will select only a few diverse questions for Professor Engle to respond to. And finally, one of my colleagues will give a vote of thanks to our guest speaker before I conclude the webinar. I now hand over to you, Professor Uma.
Thank you, Cyril. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted today to welcome each of you to listen to our esteemed guest speaker, Nobel laureate in economic sciences, Professor Robert Engle. For anyone who has worked on time series econometrics, Professor Engle needs no introduction. Nevertheless, it is my duty today to briefly give an overview of his background. Professor Engle is the current director of the New York University Stern Volatility Institute and a co-founding president of the Society for Financial Econometrics. He has enjoyed a long and illustrious career at some of the top global universities, including MIT, University of California, San Diego, and New York University. Professor Engle is widely known for developing the autoregressive conditional heteroscedasticity or ARCH method for statistical modeling of time-varying volatility, for which he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences in 2003, along with Clive Granger. Professor Engle's insights and methodologies are well known as indispensable tools for financial analysts and researchers in the field of financial economics and beyond. His research has produced several other innovative statistical methods, and many of these are taught in the School of Economics and Finance courses and regularly applied by our staff and students in their research. Today, we will be listening to what promises to be a fascinating application of these methods to climate risk. I'm sure the presentation and the panel discussion to follow will throw open many further avenues for research and potential collaboration in future. With that brief introduction, let me once again thank Professor Engle for accepting our invitation and now hand over back to Cyril for the rest of the proceedings.
Thank you for the brief yet informative biography of Prof. Uma. I'd now like to move on to the focal point of this webinar. Professor Engle, the floor is yours.
Now, once again, it's a great pleasure to be with you today, and I'm very happy to help celebrate this this wonderful milestone from your great university. I've never visited with you, but I have been in South Africa quite a few times, and I'm going to show you a picture when I open my slides that makes that clear. So let me share my screen now. Okay, so this is the scene of your university, of the Wits University that I've not seen, but looks mighty spectacular. But I have been not so far away. We visited the Dambala Game Reserve, which is just a couple hours away, and I've also been at several of the other universities in South Africa. But when we were in Dambala, we stayed at the Nelson Mandela Center for Reconciliation. And you can see here this beautiful plaque, which is on the front of it. And it turns out it's so shiny that you can see me taking a picture of it. So he is a remarkable man and one of your great alums, apparently. And that is also a great honor. The stay we had with our children and grandchildren was so memorable. They all went home and wrote reports about Mandela, and the chance to be in close proximity to where he did so many important things was breathtaking. So I'd like to talk today about climate change, and I'm going to talk about it sort of in general at first, but then we'll get a little more specific about the implications for South Africa and many other emerging markets, and some of the research that we're doing at New York University at the VRI, the Volatility and Risk Institute, to illustrate how financial markets can respond to this kind of a crisis. So the introduction is, I guess, sort of simple, because we all know that climate change is one of the most pressing problems of our times. The science of this is pretty well understood, and it's easy to understand. And I like to say that every time you go to the kitchen to boil some potatoes or something like that, you're reminded how this works. You put the pot on the stove, you put the potatoes in the water, and then you cover it. And the cover is like the greenhouse gases. And that makes the water boil faster and hotter. And it's much like the way the planet changes. And we can think of ourselves as the potatoes. We're heating up. So I think there is a lot of big consensus that what we are seeing around us is often due to climate change, but the solutions that we've considered seem some ways too painful to implement. So we're going to talk today about what are the damages from climate change and what are the costs of methods to try to stop it. And then we'll take a look at impacts on regions like South Africa. So the scientific view is that the Earth is warming, human activities are the primary cause, and that we are distorting the natural carbon cycle by emitting more CO2 and other greenhouse gases than the planet can absorb. And so these accumulate in the atmosphere rather than elsewhere in the planet, which is where carbon is typically stored. So as a consequence of this, we see rising temperatures, rising sea level, but also droughts and wildfires, floods and storms. These physical consequences are easy to see. The economic costs, however, are difficult to measure precisely. And we are seeing some of them now, and we're going to see a lot more in the future. So we're going to call all of these physical effects, physical risks. And this is one of the risks of climate change, or the physical risks. So what causes excessive greenhouse gas emissions? Well, economists have an answer for that. They say it is caused by externalities, which are a classic explanation in economics. Greenhouse gases are emitted freely. There is no charge for that, but it imposes costs on others. So it's a classic externality. And as a consequence, the market cannot solve this on its own. The reason for that is it's what's called a free rider problem. So here's an example of what I mean by a free rider problem. A firm that does not cut emissions when everyone else does will have the benefit of a better climate without the cost of emission reductions. This firm will be able to outperform its competitors in product, labor, and capital markets, and therefore we call this firm a free rider. So how do we solve the free rider problem? Well, the primary solutions are either to price carbon emissions or to regulate them. And we'll talk about those approaches shortly. If we fail to solve the problem of excessive greenhouse gas emissions, then the physical consequences are predicted to be dire. And these are documented in the IPCC kind of reports and much of the scientific literature. But to evaluate the economic consequences, this is to turn it into dollars and cents, we use integrated assessment models that have been constructed to combine science models and economic models. In these models, the climate affects the economy and the economy affects the climate. The first of these was the DICE model that Nordhaus created and received the Nobel Prize for its creation. So how do these models measure damages? Well, we have to take into account what we call adaptation, which is the natural response of forward-looking firms and households and governments to reduce the damages. In other words, if you think it's going to be hotter in the future, maybe you're going to put in air conditioning. Maybe you'll put in better insulation. These would be natural things to do. They are not designed to slow climate change. They're merely designed to reduce the damages. So sometimes these things are done by individuals. Sometimes they're done by the government. Sometimes they're done one time, and other times you have to do it every year. So calculating the cost of adaptation is part of measuring the damages. So the typical integrated assessment model is what we call a bottom-up model. It analyzes the impact of climate change on each sector if we just continue doing business as usual. We calculate the impact on each sector, allowing the sector to do adaptation, but keeping track of the cost of the adaptation. So the damages are the cost of the adaptation plus the remaining losses after you've done the adaptation. So we add these all together, we sum them across sectors, we discount the future damages at a discount rate, and that is our measure of the total present discounted value of future damages that we can expect. So what do we see when we do this? Well, from the DICE model and Nordhaus's analysis of it, it turns out the sectors which are most highly impacted are currently a very small part of the US economy. He thinks of agriculture, forests, and fisheries as the most impacted, with moderate impacts in medicine, coastal real estate, transportation, construction, and utilities. And then the remaining 90% of the US economy is not really so impacted by climate change. And consequently, the damages to the US economy look like they're not so great. In fact, these vulnerable sectors are shrinking over time, and this is expected to continue, so that maybe this climate change problem is not going to create such great damages. Well, have been a lot of critiques of this, this analysis. Here are some of them. First of all, non-market damages should be measured too. If we destroy the environment and it's not nice to live there, that should be measured as well. Secondly, rising temperature will spur migration to more favorable environments. And so the capital that's left behind will be discounted or abandoned, and this is a cost. The costs of migration should also include all the new capital construction in the new location. So migrations have lots of consequences and lots of costs that should be put in here, including ultimately war and other kinds of serious costs. In addition, there may be tipping points. Tipping points are times when, if the climate gets just a little bit worse, it will become irreversible and self-reinforcing. Some things, such as when the climate starts getting warm, methane starts to melt from the polar ice caps. That methane has very strong greenhouse gas effects and will raise the temperature more, so that even more methane is emitted. And this is an example of a tipping point. Uncertainty about the location and timing of climate events is a cost, which is not considered. And these uncertain events may be very extreme. And so it might be that looking at what we expect is really not the right way to analyze these damages, because we might want to be interested in worst case scenarios. And the discount rate is controversial, to say the least. A low discount rate means the future is much more, the damages that are in the distant future are treated as more important. And there are a lot of reasons to think that the discount rate may be lower than was used by Nordhaus. So an alternative approach is rather interesting, which is what is called a top-down approach. And it's based on an observation that we know and understand pretty well, which is many of the most profitable and fastest growing regions of the world are in temperate climates. They're not where it's too cold, but they're also not where it's too warm. And if this is really a structural relationship, then what that means is, as the planet gets warmer, there will be some of these temperate regions will become hot regions, and their productivity and growth rates may fall as a result. Simple econometrics supports this, and panel data models find a very natural quadratic relationship with average temperatures. It's not clear whether this is a structural relationship or not, but it's certainly an empirical finding. So if you take this as if it's a structural relationship, damages can be estimated from this relationship and turn out to be very large and continuing. Some regions will experience severe damages, while others may actually experience some benefits, according to this analysis. Consequently, it's going to be hard to get all countries and regions to agree on solutions to climate change, particularly if they're costly. So some countries in this calculation may actually be beneficiaries, like Canada, Northern Europe, and Russia. the biggest damages will probably be felt by tropical countries. But even within countries, there are clear regional differences. In Italy, for example, where I also have been talking about this, the north is much more productive than the south. And so even within a country, you might find that warming the climate is going to reduce the growth rate of the more prosperous northern section relative to the south. So here's a map that is in a paper by Ricky and her co-authors, which is color-coded for what we are going to talk about as the social cost of carbon. And as you can see, the blue areas are where the social cost of carbon, that is the actual measure of the damages due to an additional climate emission, are blue, which means that is actually the damages are negative. In other words, it's a benefit. Whereas in many of the tropical regions, it's orange, and in some it's red, which are the most hard-hit regions. South Africa appears to be sort of in the middle in terms of its damages. But thinking about South Africa more specifically, it seems that at least two, and this is pretty casual empiricism by me, two of the most important industries in South Africa are probably agriculture and tourism. And agriculture is particularly impacted by physical risks. Heat and drought all inflict heavy damages on our agriculture. And adaptations such as planting new varieties is expensive and also may ruin your market share. In addition, tourism is impacted by heat and extreme weather too. And the two of the other and perhaps more important sectors in South Africa are mining and manufacturing. These may be less impacted by the physical damages, although South Africa's been suffering from a water shortage now for many years, and I think this is getting worse. Last time I was in Cape Town, there was very severe water rationing, and the whole wine district was suffering from this. So I think that there is a lot of scope for thinking that South Africa is pretty vulnerable to a lot of the physical risks that we're talking about today. So in summary, we've discussed these physical risks associated with climate change. They may be extreme in regions like South Africa. And so the question is, what can be done? It's clear that if we can reduce our emissions of greenhouse gases, this will reduce the progression of climate change and ultimately lead to perhaps a recovery from what we've seen so far, although because CO2 in the atmosphere lasts a long time, we're not really going to stop it, even if we stop all emissions suddenly. But if our goal is to reduce emissions, then this is going to hurt some firms much more than others, but ultimately be good for the planet. So there are going to be some costs that are not borne equally by all parts of the economy, of the global economy, and that is what we should talk about next. These are called transition risks, and the costs of trying to mitigate climate change creates transition risks. So transition risks will serve to reduce physical risks, but they are both risks that we're going to see. And transition risks are sort of risks that we do to ourselves by transitioning our economies from fossil fuels to greener technologies, and these have costs. So how do we do this kind of mitigation? Well, economists again have a simple answer. They suggest a carbon tax. By charging firms and possibly households for their emissions of greenhouse gases, the economy can most efficiently reallocate resources and consumption to mitigate climate change. This is a classic solution called the Pigouvian tax. This is a classic solution in economics to externalities. The tax revenue could then be used to reduce other taxes, in which case it would be revenue neutral, and that might stimulate other industries while it's hurting the ones that have big emissions. A popular approach to doing a carbon tax is the cap and trade system, where firms must buy certificates permitting them to emit a certain amount of greenhouse gases. And the European trading system is a leading example of a cap and trade system. We'll talk about that in the next slide. So how do you set a carbon tax or an emissions ceiling? Well, let me give you a simple example. Let me ask you a question. Would you pay 10 euros for a policy that would reduce your damages by 12 euros? I think the answer is yes. You pay 10, you get 12 euros of benefits. But you wouldn't pay 15 for the same policy because you'd be paying more than the damages would be reduced. So this is a cost-benefit argument. And in order to apply this, we need to calculate what's called the marginal social cost of carbon that I already mentioned. And that's the amount of damages that would be felt by the entire world if we emit 1 additional ton of CO2. So 1 additional ton of CO2 will have a small effect on the total planet and all the economies in this planet, but that small effect will be added up over the whole world. So you'll see a number. And if you could pay this person not to emit this ton of carbon, of CO2, then it would, the benefits would be felt throughout the world. Okay, so this is a magic number which allows you to compute whether a policy has benefits that exceeds its costs. How big is this number? Well, there is a great deal of research about this and no certainty about it. If we think it's a number something like 100 euros a ton, how do we translate that into something we know more that's closer to home? Well, 100 euros a ton translates approximately to €1 per gallon of gasoline. When you start talking about the price of gas, we can understand how big this cost really is. And €1 per gallon of gas is not that high a price. It's also 26 cents per euro per liter of gasoline. I can't remember whether you typically buy petrol in the liter, by liter or by gallons, but anyway, this is a way of seeing it. So if you think that 100 euros is high or low, well, think about it as €1 per gallon of gasoline. And, you know, a gallon of gasoline now costs about $4 in the US. It costs about €8 in Europe. So adding another euro to that is noticeable, but it's not overwhelming. Okay, so a comprehensive carbon tax will satisfy the cost-benefit criterion if the tax rate per ton is lower than the social cost of carbon per ton. So that's a way we ought to set the tax rate more or less equal to the social cost of carbon, especially if the tax is going on everybody and on everything. An alternative approach is the cap and trade system, in which case you don't specify the price, you specify the quantity. And in order to specify the quantity of emission certificates that you're going to sell, you end up having to use scientific evidence of how much emission can we have and still not make the climate worse. And so this is a calculation that goes into the managing of a cap and trade system. At the moment, the European cap and trade system is pricing emissions at less than 100 euros per ton, but it was pretty close to that a year or two ago. So if you have a cap and trade system, then ultimately you might not sell any emission certificates. They'd be net zero, and companies that have negative emissions would sell certificates to companies with positive emissions, and that's a way of efficiently organizing the net zero emissions that we're often trying to manage. So we saw before that the damages from climate change are likely to be higher in rural regions than in urban. But what about the costs of climate mitigation? Will these be different? And I think the answer also is yes. So decarbonization requires finding alternative sources of energy. Electricity generated from renewable sources is the best we know of today, and these are likely to take place in rural areas. Solar and wind facilities are typically in rural areas, and this will provide jobs and income in these rural areas that may end up being useful sources of revenue. So I think it's possible that rural areas, certainly areas with a lot of sun and a lot of wind, are actually good areas for building renewable energy. And perhaps a country like South Africa would have a lot of places where that could be done, where more densely populated countries with more rain and fog are not such attractive sources of renewable electricity. So it may be that the costs of mitigation will be higher in more densely populated countries and lower in rural areas. So it's clear that there are winners and losers from climate mitigation. And in the US, this has more or less paralyzed climate policy at the federal level. We have really not been able to do a comprehensive carbon tax. We have not been able to do comprehensive regulation because there are too many regions that are able to block this. And even in Europe, climate policy at the moment is inadequate to achieving its goals. The US has now passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which allows for a lot of subsidy for renewable energy and will stimulate renewable construction, but it does not do anything to tax or reduce emissions of fossil energy. So one of the other things that I'm just going to say a little bit about are negative emission policies. decarbonization can occur by reducing emissions, but it can also be achieved by capturing greenhouse gases from the air and storing them permanently in the ground. This is something that plants do naturally. They take CO2 from the air to make organic materials like wood and leaves. And when plants fall to the ground, they typically will turn into soil, and that captures the CO2. If they're burned, it goes back into the atmosphere. So that's not as good an outcome. So most of the CO2 on the planet is actually in the ground or in the ocean rather than in the atmosphere. And so what we're talking about here for negative emission policies are various ways of taking it out of the air and storing it in the ground. So again, if we're talking about forests and if we're talking about agriculture, we might see the rural regions to have a comparative advantage in negative emission strategies. Some countries are actually selling their carbon credits in the open market now, and this is an interesting development. These are called carbon offsets, which essentially are negative emissions certificates. If a carbon offset reduces emissions by 1 ton, then it's just as good for the environment as if a company reduces emission. If the carbon offset pulls a ton of carbon out of the air, that's as good as having a company reduce its emissions by a ton. There are, however, lots of problems with defining carbon offsets, making sure they're actually doing what they say, and that the owners are able to deliver these benefits. But I think this is an important market, and it's quite likely that emerging markets will take advantage of their ability to reforest or do other activities which are negative carbon emission strategies, and therefore they can perhaps sell these as carbon offsets to the more industrial world. Okay, well, I mentioned the problems that the US has in doing carbon carbon taxing and mitigation. So in the US, a lot of this is being left to the private sector. And as we said at the beginning, the private sector is not very good at that because of the free rider problem. But let's talk a little bit about how this is done. So you're all pretty familiar with this plant. This is a picture from my garden in San Diego, where we've got this protea, this pincushion called Wildfire, and it's a beautiful flower. Let me ask you a question. Just I'm not sure what time we started, but what time do we have to end?
We are a bit flexible, Prof. Engle. You may continue.
I'm sorry, could you say that a little louder?
Said we are a bit flexible, so you may continue.
Okay. So what's the private sector going to do? Well, consumers, workers, and investors all have expressed their concern about climate change, and therefore companies may choose to reduce their emissions voluntarily and hope that consumers, workers, and investors all will respond positively. It may be like a form of marketing. It might be marketing to your own workers. It might be marketing to investors. We're going to talk particularly about investors because we're interested in how do we move capital into financing this climate change. And investors are often interested in social responsible investing. And the question of what that really means has become very important. We're seeing lots of regulations and discussion about socially responsible investing and the use of measurements such as ESG, which stands for environment, social, and governance, which are three characteristics that you might say are important for socially responsible investing. How do you do that? Well, let's talk about investment risk. Companies and investors both face physical and transition risks. That's why we've defined them here so that we can try to get a handle on where these risks are. Many physical risks are very geographically specific. If there's a drought in one region or a hurricane in one region, it may not affect stock markets broadly because you don't know which region is going to be hit, and so you don't know how to invest to avoid that risk. So if you can't forecast where the risk is high, you can't really protect your portfolio. And so that it might be that physical risks are sort of diversified across the entire country and portfolio. So it may be that it's hard to find a way to avoid physical risks in your portfolio. However, transition risks are pretty easy to spot, and by comparison, we know that fossil fuel producing companies are likely to be impacted by this. And of course, their customers and suppliers are also likely to be impacted. So such stocks, bonds, and loans incur extra risk. And those stocks, bonds, and loans that are riskier should be less desirable for investors and therefore have a lower price. We call this a lower price, or we call it a risk premium. So if these stocks, bonds, and loans have a risk premium associated with them, then disclosure is important so that investors know whether they are taking these risks or not. So investors that own transition risk earn a risk premium for it. Okay, that's a big point. Okay, so, but investors who are concerned about climate change do not want to own transition risk. They want to hedge transition risk. And so if you want to hedge this, what you want to do is invest in assets which have invest in assets that are well prepared for climate change and underinvest in assets which are not well prepared for climate change. And this is what we call a hedge portfolio, because it basically should outperform the market if climate change is worse than we expect, and will underperform the market if climate change is not as bad as we expect. So one strategy that investors are likely to adopt would be a climate hedge portfolio. This also would be an appropriate portfolio if you think the market does not appreciate climate risks as much as they should. So this kind of strategy we think of as an adaptive strategy, but it also has some mitigation features because it will lower the cost of capital to the climate prepared firms and increase the cost of capital to the not prepared firms. We call the first group green firms, and we call the second group brown firms. So it will reduce the cost of capital to green firms. And those are the ones that are building the renewable energy and economizing in reducing their emissions. So two approaches to this are in these papers we've done. We did a first paper that's in the Review of Financial Studies, and a second paper which is in process, which have different ways of constructing these hedge portfolios. So if you go to our website, which is at this URL up here, vlab.stern.nyu.edu, and VLAB stands for Volatility Laboratory. And what we're doing in this laboratory is reporting on the state of a lot of different kinds of risks that face financial markets. We started talking about systemic risk, and now we talk about things like geopolitical risk and cyber risk and pandemic risk, and particularly importantly, climate risk. And so we have several climate hedge portfolios that we've constructed. We update them every day, and we can see how they perform. We also follow almost 200 publicly available funds which have a climate objective. And we look at how their performance compares with either our hedge funds, hedge portfolios, or other portfolios that are available in the market. So we measure this performance every day. And so every day we get new sets of returns from these. We have measures of volatility, Sharpe ratio, and the CAPM alpha. So that's the return after you take out the market risk factor. And then we also measure the beta of each fund for the climate hedge portfolios we've constructed. And if you don't remember this URL, you can just Google VLAB NYU and you'll immediately get it. So we have two climate hedge portfolios that I'm going to talk about today. One is called a stranded asset portfolio, which is essentially a portfolio which is short 70% of a coal ETF and 30% of the broad-based energy ETF, and then is long the Standard & Poor's 500, the SPDR. So this portfolio should do well if returns to fossil energy companies fall relative to the overall market. And ultimately, if this leads them to abandon assets, then that's why we call this a stranded asset portfolio. A second portfolio we've constructed, we call a climate efficient factor mimicking portfolio, which is a portfolio of publicly available sustainable funds that's designed to have minimum variance and maximum correlation with news about climate change. And all this is done controlling for conventional risk factors, which now include the stranded asset and the oil prices. So this is a second climate portfolio. We originally thought this would probably be a physical risk portfolio, but it doesn't really have a characteristic that we would expect to see for physical risk. And in fact, none of the almost 200 portfolios that we use to select this have the word physical in them. And perhaps some of them are designed to be physical risk portfolios, but at least so far, this has not given them the outstanding performance needed to become a member of this CEP portfolio. So what do we see when we look at these benchmark portfolios on VLAB? You get a display like this with return, volatility, and Sharpe ratio. The first two are just broad market indices, and you see these over the last year have had dramatic negative returns. and of course a negative Sharpe ratio. If you look at the stranded asset portfolio, that's even worse. That's minus 23% returns. If you look at the hedge just using the broad energy sector, it's even worse, 50% decline of this portfolio. And the climate efficient factor mimicking portfolio is also done badly. So this is not a very impressive performance for any of these. If you look over a 5-year period, you see the climate efficient portfolio has actually done quite well over the long haul, and so is the stranded asset portfolio, but these two have also done positive returns. Hedging with the broad energy sector was not a good idea over 5 years either. And some of these Sharpe ratios are high enough to be interesting. If you look at the funds we follow, we can look over these over a 1-year range, and you can see that on average for all these different types of sustainable funds, they've all got a negative average alpha. Over 5 years, most of them are still negative, and only this last one is positive. Now, the negative returns on some of these portfolios might not be surprising, because if you invest in exposed assets that are exposed to transition risk, you expect to get a positive risk premium. If you short those assets, you expect to get a negative risk premium. So on average, you might expect a negative return for the CAPM alpha. However, if the climate gets worse, there is repricing of assets, which makes it turn positive. And so this might just be a period when these all are negative, or maybe they're just not performing very well. And so what we're hoping with this factor mimicking portfolio is that we're going to find the best of these portfolios, best of these funds, and put them into their own portfolio, which is our CEP portfolio. So these are the two benchmark portfolios that we've constructed to measure climate change. What do we do with these now that we've got them? One thing we could do is invest in them directly. They're both investable. In other words, you can in real time take on these investments. Second of all, we could invest in funds that are correlated with them after controlling for conventional risk factors. Thirdly, we could construct portfolios of assets that are correlated with the hedges. And we can do this, and this is a way of sort of saying which stocks or which funds are greener and put those into our portfolio. And finally, we can look at these hedge portfolios to stress test our banks to see if they are overly exposed to climate risk. And this is banks are especially important, because if they are overly exposed to climate risk and we think climate risk is coming, then this means that the banks may get into trouble when the climate risk gets bad, and we don't want to have a financial crisis at the same time we're having a climate crisis. So here's an example of what our funds look like. This is a 1-year performance, and I've ranked the top 10 funds based on their Sharpe ratio. And what you'll see, and this is as of yesterday, and what you'll see is only one of them actually has a positive Sharpe ratio. So out of 190 or 180 funds or whatever there are now, there's only one positive Sharpe ratio. Well, that's not a very impressive outcome. But what we might be interested in really is the betas on the stranded asset portfolio and the beta on the climate efficient factor mimicking portfolio. And so this is a way of measuring how green the funds are relative to stranded assets And this is how green they are relative to the second climate factor. And there are funds which are more highly correlated with each of these. You'll see here that this coefficient is quite high. That's because this is actually one of the funds that's in the climate efficient factor mimicking portfolio. And so this is one that we would be holding in that case. So let me now show you an example of what we're looking at for climate stress tests. And this is for South Africa. These are South African banks that we follow. There are another couple that are not on here. We've rated them by the capital they would need to have if we have a climate change like the stress that we've measured. How much capital would they need to recapitalize the bank after this climate change happens? So we call that C risk. It's closely parallel the S risk measure, which some of you may know about. And maybe it's easiest to see the betas. So these are the climate betas that come out of this regression. And we've estimated these climate betas using a dynamic method, which is based on really the ARCH model that I received the Nobel Prize for, but it's a time-varying beta model called dynamic conditional beta. And so we're looking now at not at what the average beta is, but what the beta is today. And so these are the biggest betas. And because we've changed the sign on the portfolio, these are the brownest banks in that same sense. They have more exposure to climate change. It may be that this is not such a big number and maybe we're not worried about it, but it's something that we want to keep track of going forward. Now, the last topic I want to talk a little bit about is current events. And I've shown you a bunch of things which are kind of pessimistic. I've shown you how these sustainable funds are underperforming. Our benchmark funds are underperforming. What's going on and how does this happen? So the simple answer is what's happening is the energy sector is currently doing very well. The fossil energy sector is very profitable while the broad market is declining. And that's the reason these benchmark portfolios are doing badly. It's also the reason that the sustainable funds are doing badly. But that does not answer the question of why is the energy sector doing so well and the rest of the economy is doing badly. It's pretty clear why the rest of the world's economy is doing badly, and that's because we have a lot of fear of inflation and raising interest rates and potentially raising them so much that we'll have a recession. So that's hurting the overall broad market. But why is the energy sector doing so well? Well, let's talk about it. Are there any of you in this audience that are interested in or have watched the Star Wars movies? Well, the Emperor in the Star Wars movies had an expression which we need today. Everything is proceeding as I have foreseen. It's a very ominous saying, obviously, but does it really apply today? Well, let's talk about it. If there is insufficient government carbon pricing, then the private sector will try to implement its own decarbonization. And how is it going to do that? Well, we've already talked about it. We're going to reduce investments in fossil energy companies by investors. We're going to reduce investments in fossil energy companies by banks. And the companies themselves may not invest for the future so much. Why not? Well, if you think that the transition is going to actually happen over the next decade or two, you're not going to invest over with a 30 or a 50-year horizon for new drilling and all the kinds of things that the energy companies have been doing for generations. So I think that we're going to see a reduction of investment by energy companies as well as investors and the banks. And therefore, the supply of energy is going to shift inward. We could think of a supply curve and a demand curve for energy, but the supply curve is going to shift inward. And what that does is it raises the price. So supply will be reduced, and when supply will be reduced, which makes the price go up. And if demand increases, which I think it's doing now, then the price of energy will go up even more, and profits to these energy companies will rise. But they're rising because energy companies and everybody else are trying to decarbonize. So consumers will complain, but they will also try to adjust their behavior to use less fossil energy. Businesses will also reduce fossil energy use. And ultimately, a combination of reduction of demand for fossil energy and increasing supplies of renewable power should achieve decarbonization goals. So we have always recognized that the transition is going to require higher fossil energy prices. That's actually the signal for people to economize on fossil energy and for people to invest in renewable energy. So private sector seems to be effectively moving to decarbonize. Even the energy companies appear to be believing in climate change. In fact, even Putin seems to be a climate believer and maybe a climate activist. Why do I say that? Well, why did he invade Ukraine now? His oil and gas empire is going to be worth less in the future than it is today. That means he has got to do it today. And if Europe is going to be better prepared to live on renewable energy in a decade, then he's also got to do it today. So I think he also believes in climate change. And this is his response. Energy companies may be trying to diversify. He has found a different way to try to diversify, which is unthinkable, but it's what he has done. Consequently, he is also shifting the energy supply curve inward. We're getting less energy from Russia. Actually, Saudi Arabia has now joined on reduction of this. And so energy prices are going up faster and faster because all these supply curves are shifting inward just at a time when demand is recovering from the pandemic. So we're seeing very high prices for energy. Fear of inflation has leading the voters to, fear of inflation is leading the Fed to and central banks to try to restrict the economies. That also is going to have some contribution to decarbonization. And we can think of ourselves as blaming Putin for this inflation rather than blaming the politicians and climate activists. I don't know whether that's really a benefit, but in any case, I think it's one of the things that's happening. And then finally, what should we be doing? We should be massively subsidizing renewable power. And that's in fact exactly what the US Inflation Reduction Act that was just passed by Congress is trying to do. Okay, so the first priority for what are the implications for regional economies? The first priority for regions is to become a voting bloc that can push for government mitigation of climate change. If you're more exposed, you ought to be a big advocate for mitigation. A second goal would be to supply renewable power and carbon offsets, creating jobs and income for rural regions. A third goal is to be smart about adapting to climate change. This may be aided by new technologies and practical experience, and government should assist with information and help with financing. And then I have not mentioned this previously, but a fourth goal, which is very controversial, but must be very apparent to South Africa, as well as many other countries. A fourth goal is to ask for reparations from the big countries that have contributed the most to the greenhouse gases. This is a topic which will be discussed in the next few weeks at COP27, which is taking place in Egypt. It's complicated and contentious. I think actually it's not going to be something that the developed countries are going to agree to, but they may agree to some piece of it. There have been agreements in the past with no action. But in any case, I think it makes sense for countries that have contributed a lot, a very small part of the greenhouse gases, to ask for this from countries that have submitted a lot, but I don't know whether it's the most constructive. I tend to think the first three stand on their own. The fourth would be gravy if you can get it. So what is in the future? My grandsons are pretty worried. They think we're screwing up the planet, and I think they're right. But if we can tell them that the problem has been solved, or at least that we have a solution in mind, they'll be a lot happier. So let me stop at this point, and if there's time for questions, I will be happy to take them.
Thank you for the insightful and stimulating presentation, Professor Engle. Given a diverse audience with varying degrees of knowledge of the subject matter, I'm sure we will all have a takeaway from your presentation. As you have already noted, climate risk raises many questions pertaining to the investment decisions of firms, but also presents further questions about stock price formation and volatility and equity risk premiums. Additionally, climate risk has implications for financial stability, policy formulation and implementation, regulation, and econometric modeling. So we now enter the discussion phase of the webinar. Our first panelist to pose some questions to Professor Engle is my colleague, Dr. Dambala Kutela, who was recently promoted to Associate Professor of Economics. One of his research interests is energy transition, which can provide solutions to many global issues, including efforts against climate change. So please lead the panel discussion, Dambala.
Thank you, Cyril. Thank you, Professor Engle, and thank you for such a wonderful presentation and enlightening the talk. And I have two questions. One is, you rightly say that there are two climate risks, one being physical risk, the other transition risk. And your analysis seems to kind of focus on transitional risk and how market react to that. But again, market can maybe differently react to physical risk too. And if the market is differently kind of reacting to these two sorts of risks, I think that's likely to undermine the decarbonization outcomes by the private sector. And I just wanted to know how these interaction of market react with risk source could lead to some kind of net effects, and how that can kind of undermine the decarbonization outcomes of the private sector. That is the first one. Second one is, for the most part, climate events are not kind of salient like other political and economic events. And therefore, market participants may not kind of correctly perceive the risk, and this leads to a distortion of climate risk perception. And then a market may not understand the climate risk information there, and then this leads to kind of significant delay in stock price adjustments. It just appeared that climate risk awareness should be high enough to support sustainable investment, like you said, in which a stock market may hedge against bad outcomes. Would significant value be added if the analysis, your analysis, involved a greater exposure to media coverage about the climate risk among market participants? That's two questions for me. Thank you.
You know, I'm sorry, I'm having electronic problems here. I can't seem to get my my picture back on again, and I'm having a hard time hearing you, which is unfortunate.
Okay. The first one is short. Yeah, the first one shortly is like you mentioned two types of climate risk, and
Right.
you did analysis for the transition risk and unpacked how market react to it. But it seems that you haven't done for the market reaction to physical risk, which could have different effect in terms of the market reaction. And then the net effect on balance could be kind of maybe undermining the private sector decarbonization outcomes. So I just wanted to know your take on this.
Okay, so in many ways, the physical risk is a great objective function for people studying climate change, because it's so the risks are so obvious, and yet it's very hard to know how to construct particularly an equity portfolio that is immune to that. And because stocks really are not location specific. So hedge portfolios for physical risk are more likely to be effective if the asset class is not equities. So, for example, there is a new paper by Viral Acharya and some co-authors that say, let's consider heat risk as the main element that might be priced of physical risk. And it turns out that where heat waves are more common and the temperature is higher, things like bonds from companies in those locations, or municipal bonds from nonprofits and local governments in these areas, actually have a little bit wider spread, so they're treated as riskier by the financial markets. So that's a suggestion that in the fixed income market, you might do better at finding physical risk, and heat might be an example of it. Why would this be something that you could expect? Well, because these companies need to have a bigger air conditioning budget. They need to have perhaps better insulation, or people can't work outdoors as much, or so you need a bigger facility. There are a variety of reasons why you might expect costs to be higher in areas where heat waves are more common and more intense. So could you construct a physical risk measure from this? Well, I guess you could look at the difference between the distance to default of municipal bonds from hot areas and non-hot areas. And that might be something like a hedge portfolio, and it might be something that could be used to measure physical risk. Another thought that we've been pursuing is whether insurance companies that insure, for example, hurricane damage, might provide an equity based measure for this kind of damage. But hurricanes don't seem to have a straightforward impact on insurance companies, partly because where hurricanes are more likely, premiums are higher. And so damages are higher, but the damages are localized, so the insurance company doesn't necessarily lose money by damages, since they've insured over a broad range of areas. So this is work in progress. It's just that it's a little bit complicated to deal with the actual institutional arrangements of insurance companies. But I think the goal of finding a way to hedge physical risk it's one of the great unsolved problems for climate finance.
Our next discussant, also from the School of Economics and Business Sciences, whose focus area is the application of empirical analytical techniques to finance, Professor Yudhvir Seetharam. He is also the current head of analytics, insight, and research at First National Bank Business. The floor is yours, Yudhvir.
Thanks, Cyril. Thank you as well, Prof, for a very insightful presentation. Just checking if sound is fine on your side.
Yes, I can hear you.
Awesome. So I guess my first one is that if we look at climate risk as something that the corporation needs to consider when they are making decisions on projects or capital structure, that should lead to an increase in fundamental value because there's increased efficiencies that come in from going green. On the other hand, you do have the stock market, and prices that are impacted by a whole bunch of factors. One of them might be climate risk. So if we look at incorporating climate risk as both something that the firm does and something that the market prices, would you go and say that this climate risk premium might actually be let's maybe use the phrase double counting, where both the firm is going green and investors are overly rewarding the firm from going green, if prices are supposed to hover around fundamental values?
The finance theory of this is that basically when you do asset allocation using conventional risk factors, trying to mop up all the stuff that you're talking about, there's a factor missing. And we say there's an alpha there for some companies which would disappear if you actually had the climate factor in there. So in that case, the expected return on a company would be the expected return on the climate factor times the beta on the climate factor. That's the classic asset pricing. And so that's not really double counting. That's what we say the expected return ought to be. So the question is, are these climate factors that we're using actually, do they have a positive expected return? Well, certainly the realized return recently has been very negative. Over long periods of time, it's positive. And in fact, if in our data set, you can look at it for 20 years, or you can look at it for the most recent 10 years or whatever. And for 5 years, they were positive. I showed you that. But so the expected return on a green asset should have these two parts, but it may have other pieces of its expected return as well, of course.
Perfect, 100%. I guess just to follow up on the techniques, right? When we want to go and price this climate risk, we can turn to analytical or data science-driven techniques in order to understand the risk and be able to price it in a much more quicker fashion. Given that climate risk is something that's quite long-term, if I'm able to understand and price in more real-time approaches, is it really of any economic value to measure and manage a very long-term risk? So is there value in trying to understand and price quicker, knowing that the risk I'm trying to hedge is quite long-term?
Yes, well, so mostly the risks that we're actually hedging are actually not the risks themselves, but they're assets which are sensitive to those risks. So asset prices are inherently forward-looking, and whether they're sufficiently forward-looking is, of course, a question of you know, how good are the markets at doing this. But in a sense, the risk that we're facing is that we hold assets that where the probability or the severity of this future event is changing. And it might change because of scientific evidence, or it might change because the market just becomes more convinced this is going to be true, or whatever. Anyway, there's subjective probabilities and objective probabilities all sort of tangled together to give you the asset price. So if that changes, then you've experienced the risk. And so when we've built these climate hedge portfolios, one of the things that we're trying to do is measure when there is information about that the climate risk is changing. And I didn't really talk about that today, but that's a key part of this climate efficient factor mimicking portfolio is what's the news on climate change, and which stocks respond to that news, and which funds respond to that news. Is it worth trying to figure out what the distant events are when what you really want to know is what the asset market is pricing them as? I think that there's a lot of confusion about that. I think that central banks are embarked on processes of trying to figure out what the physical events are going to be in the distant future under some scenario, and then suppose that the assets are priced under that same scenario. But is there any reason why investors are all going to agree that that's the scenario? You know, it's important to know whether, you know, what investors are actually doing. I mean, this question of whether the banks are overly exposed is a good example of that, because if investors are really not very concerned about the distant future, then the bank assets aren't going to be very impacted by changing information. Whereas if they're pretty sensitive to this kind of information, then the bank assets will be fluctuating a lot. So, but the same thing is true for investors' portfolios. That's why we're typically based on using all forward-looking assets in these analyses rather than the actual physical dynamics that is going on.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Prof. Cyril?
Thank you.
We now move to our third and final panelist, another colleague of mine from Wits University, Professor Greg Farrell. His main interests lie in financial and macro-prudential policy and applied time series econometrics. I now invite Greg to raise another or two significant questions. The floor is yours, Greg.
Thanks,
Thank
Cyril.
you.
Thanks, Professor Engle. Very important topic for a coal-based economy like South Africa's that faces significant transition risks. I had two questions, but I'll just give one in the interest of time and see if the second one is possible. The question is on regulation, on climate change and financial stability regulation in particular. If we accept that climate change is real and important, there's no question about that, then this question is about the nature of the risk to the financial system that emanates from climate change. Some fairly conservative commentators, like John Cochrane, I guess, would provide definitions of climate risk to the financial system that suggest that these risks, from a regulatory perspective, are not sufficient to justify the inclusion of climate policy in financial regulation. You would go into aspects like that it's unexpected, that it's large, that it changes the distribution of the probability of weather sufficiently enough to cause a systemic risk. So my question then is, for you, what are the key vulnerabilities for financial stability from climate change, and how could they translate into systemic financial crises? And essentially, how should we regulate them? The second question, just for interest, was on time series econometricians and why so many eminent time series econometricians are working on climate at the moment. But if you have time.
Okay, well, that's a good question too. So Cochrane and I actually had a debate at the National Bureau of Economic Research, I think a summer ago, and I think the answer I gave to the previous question was pretty much what I said to Cochrane too, that expectations and forward-looking asset prices are forward-looking, so we don't have to wait till the climate event occurs in order to see the systemic risk. And so it's not clear to me whether these are actually big enough that this does pose a systemic risk. In fact, our measures look like they're coming down for many of the banks. So there was a peak in 2020 or 2021. The pandemic certainly made the banks look made energy prices collapse, and I think was really hard on the banks because they were quite exposed to that. I think they've reduced their exposures, partly because they know that the regulators are working on this problem, and they don't want to be caught with too much exposure to the fossil energy sector, partly because they've joined this one of these organizations, GFANS or something, that is committed to getting to net zero in their holdings in a decade or two, and partly because the banks, like everybody else, sort of foresees that this is not a long-term sector, that the fossil energy sector is going to be smaller in the future than it is today, and so it's not where you want to be putting your long-run money. So anyway, I think that the market is pricing and is sort of effective at pricing this kind of risk, and that the financial institutions are not at this point so exposed to it as they even were 2 years ago, I think. And but we're, one of the things about VLab is we keep updating everything on a daily or weekly basis, so that it's a monitor. We can see where the exposures are high and where the exposures are not, and we can follow them. It's almost a continuous time stress test, and that's one of the reasons why we've put this big structure up, and we're following it. So why are econometricians doing climate research? Well, the reason we're doing it is partly because we're committed to studying all different kinds of novel risks that are facing financial markets, including cyber risk, geopolitical risk, pandemic risk, as well as the original what we called just financial risks. And so it's a natural extension of what we've been doing. I think a lot of the econometricians that are doing climate econometrics now are doing it because actually science doesn't know about the tools that we've developed in time series, and that things like co-integration are kind of natural concepts when you're talking about, long-term co-movements of things. And so I think there's a hope that, and I guess volatility models are natural when you're talking about risks. So these are natural questions to ask, and there's good data and plentiful data, maybe not always what you want, but there are a lot of things. So I think that it's appealing for people.
Thank you. Thanks, Cyril.
Thank you.
Thank you, Greg, Yudhvir and Dambala, for posing pertinent and undoubtedly relevant questions, and to Prof. Engle for your clear responses. There doesn't appear to be any questions posted to the chat box by the audience, and given the time constraints, we move on to the final item on the agenda, a vote of thanks to Professor Engle by my colleague, Mr. James Bernstein, who lectures financial risk management in the school, but also currently leads the risk management unit at Genesis Analytics. And also worth noting is that Mr. Bernstein is a former student of Professor Engle at the University of California. I hand over to you, James.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Excellent. I'd just like to say thank you so much, Rob. This has been totally fascinating, and I know you're an extremely busy person, and thank you so much for spending the time to give us an absolutely fascinating discussion. We've had the opportunity to hear your thoughts, and I'm sure it's going to provide some interesting topics to go forward with, and possibly some interesting PhD topics as well. I'd like to thank the rest of the team, Mimosa and Talani, your assistant, Matt, who's very kind in terms of the other logistics, and of course the discussants of Greg, Dambala, and Yudhvir. And least but not last, Muma, who provided a wonderful platform for conducting these webinars. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And that brings us to the end of the webinar. But before we conclude the session, any final word from you, Professor Engle?
Well, next time I'm in South Africa, I want to come see you guys. It's guys and women. It's a place that I like very much, and my son spent a year at the University of Cape Town, and we had our 50th wedding anniversary at Shambhala. So it's a special country. So anyway, thank you for the invitation, and I hope that that this is interesting, and maybe you'll do research and push this forward, because Africa is really one of the places where these impacts are extraordinary.
Thank you. And on that note, I would definitely like to add that we are looking forward to hosting you. So do let us know when you're in this part of the world.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Okay, bye.